welcome back after Sunday lunch, getting used to this beautiful weather. We now have a section about ideology and pragmatism in foreign policy. There has been a bit of confusion about the topic of concession. Finally, we have decided that Professor Gardini is going to talk about ideology and pragmatism in foreign policy. For those of you who don't have the biographies, Gian Luca Gardini is a professor of international relations and Latin American politics at the University of Nuremberg. He also was a senior lecturer at the University of Bath. He holds a Master's of Philosophy and PhD from the University of Cambridge. And we are all looking forward to hearing from you about ideology and pragmatism in foreign policy.
Thank you, Eleonora. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Andres and Fredo, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to see you and to visit you in Lisbon, especially at this time of the year, where we have 10 centimeters snow in Nuremberg, so you can appreciate the contrast. Yes, as Eleonora said, there was a little bit of discussion about the topic of my presentation. And Italians like to have good relations with everybody. So I will focus on ideology and pragmatism in foreign policy, but in order not to disappoint those who want you to hear something about regionalism, power, region in a multipolar order, I have added one or two considerations about that towards the end. To begin with, the idea of ideology and pragmatism in foreign policy is nothing new, it's nothing original. I'm not claiming any originality in what I'm going to say. The only small claim about originality actually has to do with how we employ ideology and pragmatism to study foreign policy. What I mean by that? I mean that the idea behind this presentation and behind this paper is to try and locate the motives for the employment of ideology and pragmatism in foreign policy, to try and locate the sources of ideology and pragmatism in foreign policy, and to try and identify the agents that promote or reject a more pragmatic or a more ideological approach to foreign policy. I will come back to definitions in a minute, but let me stress from the very beginning that the purpose here is not to establish a dichotomy. A policy is either ideological or pragmatic. Ideology and pragmatism actually are integral components of any foreign policy, I would say any policy and any human behavior to a certain extent. Not only that, but I would also reject the association between ideology as something not based on solid evidence or solid values, and pragmatism as something more positive associated with careful consideration. It's just the way we employ the two terms that is quite interesting here, but I will return to this in a moment. So, the plan of this short presentation is to introduce you to the idea of pragmatism, ideology, and also erratic behavior in foreign policy. Then I would like to share with you some ideas about 5 factors that may determine not only the outcome of foreign policy, but also the way foreign policy is in fact designed, adopted, and later on implemented. And specifically, I'm interested in looking at how ideology and pragmatism characterize these 3 phases. That is, design, adoption, and implementation of foreign policy. And the 5 determinants I would like to discuss with you today are the objectives of foreign policy, the available means, the agent or the weight of the human factor, the process through which foreign policy is again designed, adopted, and implemented, and also the structure of the context in which foreign policy takes place. Then I will add two more considerations about something new that is happening to Latin America, and something about regionalism, whether it is regional integration, cooperation is not really important here today. And I will finally try to do some conclusion that perhaps may serve as a basis for our discussion. Now, most of the examples I will use refer to Latin American cases, for the simple fact that Latin America is my area of expertise, and the book is in fact about Latin American foreign policies between ideology and pragmatism. But I would very warmly invite you to think in terms of this tension between ideology and pragmatism just as a framework that can be applied to other regions of the world. And I also think that conceptual frameworks and theories are useful as far as they help us understand and make sense of reality. That's why I will accompany all my conceptual ideas about ideology and pragmatism in foreign policy with specific examples, all of which, of course, come from Latin America. But I'm sure you can find a lot of examples or circumstances that apply to your own area of interest. So even before starting with the conceptualization, I would like to start with the empirical evidence. So where does the idea of this conceptualization come from? A few examples. The first one is about Argentina. The literature has perceived Argentina as a country with a kind of erratic foreign policy, where there is, or it is very difficult to find any clear pattern. However, I would challenge you to think differently, and to think, are these examples that I'm going to give you a sign of ideological behavior, a sign of rather pragmatic behavior, or a sign of erratic, completely erratic behavior? First example, starting from the 1970s, the Argentine dictatorship made a strong ideological point in its fight against communism. However, in order to survive, it happily traded wheat and other cereals with the Soviet Union. So is this ideological, is this pragmatic, or is this just nonsense or erratic? Some years after that, when President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner took power, succeeding her own husband, she decided to reorient the country's foreign policy towards a rapprochement with the traditional Argentine allies, namely the United States and Western Europe. However, one of the first measures she took was to raise again the issue of the Falkland Malvinas Island. And she even appointed as ambassador to the UK a lady called Alicia Castro, who was famous for her quite strong positions about the Falkland Malvinas. So was this just a very clumsy appointment? Was it made to mark an ideological stance? Or did it hide some pragmatic choices behind? Another example about Nicaragua. President Ortega, Daniel Ortega of Nicaragua, who was also the leader of the Sandinista revolution at the end of the 1970s, was then elected to power again, and he actually adopted a quite strong rhetoric against the United States, against capitalism. He decided to join the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, led by former President Chavez of Venezuela. At the same time, Daniel Ortega strongly campaigned for the ratification of a free trade area between the United States itself and Central American countries, including Nicaragua. So once again, is he simply erratic, too ideological, or quite smart and pragmatic? Another example that comes from Ecuador. President Correa of Ecuador also adopted a quite skeptical stance towards the US influencing the continent, and also some of the probably excesses of the capitalist model in Latin America. So President Correa decided not to renew the agreement for a US military base in Ecuador. He also decided to reject and stop negotiations for a free trade area with the United States, but at the same time, he actively campaigned for the renewal of a US law, US domestic law, that offered Andean countries free access to the US market. So was it ideological, was it pragmatic, or was it just crazy? Another example from Brazil. There is a strong sense that Brazil is the champion of the poor, the champion of the developing world. However, this is also accompanied by a strong sense that Brazil wants to join the club of the rich and the most powerful. Now, can we combine the two things? Well, apparently we can, because the strong rhetoric in favor of development, in favor of the developing world, is actually accompanied by a pattern of voting in all major international organizations. So Brazil votes in all major international organizations along the lines of the US, much more often than it votes along the lines of other developing countries. Finally, Venezuela, perhaps the most evident example of this tension between pragmatism and ideology. In spite of the strong anti-US rhetoric, the sometimes anti-US policy adopted by the Chavez administration and later on by the Maduro administration, the fact remains that the US is still the major purchaser of Venezuelan oil and its #1 trade partner of Venezuela. So, this is to say, are we really sure that ideology and pragmatism are somehow contradictory terms? Or are they not just different aspects of the same thing? Are they not the two sides of the moon? You cannot have, in a way, one without the other. And in fact, one may be subservient to the other. So here I come to my first definition. What is, first of all, an ideological foreign policy? Well, it's a foreign policy that emphasizes principles and doctrine over adaptability and practical consequences. It's not a crazy foreign policy. It's just a foreign policy that privileges some principle, some beliefs over adaptability and the consequences of your actions. On the other side of the spectrum, a more pragmatic foreign policy is based on usefulness, workability, and practicality, with a lot of attention to the consequences produced by your foreign policy decisions, choices, and actions. And if you want to complement this dual approach with an erratic foreign policy, an erratic foreign policy is inconsistent in conduct and uncertain in movement. Now, before moving on to the 5 factors that I want to discuss with you today, let me stress one point. It's relatively easy and certainly quite comfortable to discuss foreign policy and to criticize foreign policy from the vantage point of a wonderful academic chair in Lisbon or in Nuremberg, where the major consequence of a mistake is a delayed publication. It's much more difficult to run the foreign policy of the country. The consequences are much bigger. Loss of employment, potential conflict, and I don't think that all policymakers are either stupid, incompetent, corrupted, or not well-meaning. Quite on the contrary. But the constraints we face in academia are at least very different from the constraints that policymakers do face every day when making their choice. And the picture on the right is a gentleman whom you may have already heard about, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was president of Brazil. But before becoming a politician, he was an academic. And he was a Marxist sociologist. And he became one of the presidents with the most conservative economic policy in the history of Brazil. So there is a difference between discussing things academically and running a country. So, what is then interesting in my approach? Why should you stay here and listen to what I have to say for the next half an hour? Well, first of all, if you look at foreign policy analysis, generally foreign policy analysis is based on 3 levels of analysis. That is the individual level, the national level and the international level. However, you may also have heard that more and more we talk about intermestic spaces. Those areas where the international and the national intersect and interact. And because of globalization, because of the blurring boundary between what is strictly speaking national and what actually has an international impact, I think that this quite strict division between the individual level, the national level, and the international level doesn't really capture well the current complexities of our world of multipolarity, multiplex institutions, but also foreign policy. And the approach I propose here is different in two respects. First of all, it uses ideology and pragmatism as concept to define certain attitudes or certain procedures in foreign policy. But again, they are not a dichotomy. They are complementary elements. And the second element of novelty is to move away from three levels and concentrate on factors, on determinants, on drivers of foreign policy. What actually determines the process of designing, the process of adoption, and the process of implementation of foreign policy. The first area, the first factor I'd like to discuss with you is the ends and purposes of foreign policy. So why do we conduct foreign policy? What do we want to achieve? What kind of strategic goals does a government or a state have in mind? Well, if you look at the Latin American scenario, and you try to look at a number of case studies, a number of foreign policies across the whole continent, there is a first division you can make between those countries that pursue a join the club strategy versus those countries that pursue a kind of subverting the system strategy. Now, history teaches us that there is a quite clear pattern. Those countries that pursue a join the club strategy tend to adopt a more pragmatic foreign policy. They try not to stress diversity, contrast, and conflict. On the contrary, they try to stress commonality. They try to stress incremental change, gradual change. The country that perhaps most epitomizes this in the current scenario in Latin America, in my view, is Brazil. Brazil has clearly adopted a join the club strategy that is meant certainly to advance the Brazilian agenda of change too, but within an overall context of continuity. Brazil tends to stress its own commonalities with the big players, the established players, and also its commonalities with the developing world, with those who want to make a change, like the other great countries. On the other side of the spectrum, again, history and experience tell us that generally those countries that are dissatisfied with the current state of affairs tend to adopt a more ideological posture in order to change the system more radically. Once again, empirical evidence suggests that countries like Venezuela, for instance, Bolivia, or Ecuador in Latin America, who adopt a more subversive attitude, also tend to adopt more ideological foreign policy, or where the ideological component is slightly more prominent. It's more easy to detect. But if you also think of ends and purposes, it's interesting to see what so-called revolutionary governments tend to pursue in terms of foreign policy objectives. And if you look at the work by Fred Halliday, where he defines the foreign policy of revolutionary governments as a dual foreign policy, Fred Halliday defines this duality as an antinomy of revolutionary foreign policy. What does that mean? That sometimes revolutionary governments have to pursue apparently, and I stress apparently, contradictory goals and objectives. In fact, empirical observation shows that revolutionary governments tend to do two things. The first, to promote other revolutionary governments in their region or abroad, but at the same time, they pursue foreign policy that allows coexistence with established powers. And if you look at what happened in the case of Nicaragua, in the case of Cuba, and currently in the case of Venezuela, the so-called Bolivarian countries, you can detect precisely this type of dual behavior. Also, there is an interesting aspect in terms of ends and purposes. What if your objective is in fact your interlocutor? So you want to reach a certain audience rather than another one. Typical example. President Lula of Brazil in 2005 inaugurated, I think it was January the 20th something, the World Economic Forum, the gathering of the captains of industry at the heart of the capitalist values and principles in Davos, Switzerland. A few days after, he went back to Brazil and he gave the inaugural speech for the World Social Forum, where the anti-globalization movement actually sit together. The speech was more or less the same, but there was a big shift in tone. In Davos, Lula said, we're very much in favor of policies that help investment, foreign investment, big capital. We will be friendly towards entrepreneurs, comma. However, we will use most of the gains from this policy choice to sponsor our own social policies. A few days after, in Porto Alegre, Lula said exactly the same thing, but in the reverse order. He said, dear friends from NGOs and anti-globalization movement, Brazil is your friend. We will support you. We're in favor of change, comma. However, to support change, we need and we must do business also with who's and enemies. Another interesting example, if you look at the aggressive rhetoric of President Chavez, late President Chavez of Venezuela, well, the most aggressive, the starkest statements were given in Venezuela to rally domestic audiences. When he tried quite strong statements internationally, either at the UN General Assembly or the Ibero-American Summit, well, that didn't go down well. So the way in which you can play your ideological or your more pragmatic stance depends on your ends and goals, also understood as the target audience. But of course, you may have a wonderful policy objective, but you must have the means and the resources to pursue that objective. You will forgive me for the very trivial example, the Brazilian and the Guatemalan flag about traditional elements of power. Size, territory, natural resources, geography, demography, military power, economic capabilities. Now, if you're the new Guatemalan president, you will really want Guatemala to join the UN Security Council as a permanent member. But what arguments would you use? What means would you have to pursue that goal? Probably none, or very few. That's why the available means also determine not only your foreign policy stance, but also the use of pragmatism and ideology, depending on what you want to achieve and what means are at your disposal. And in fact, once again, if you look at the behavior of the so-called haves and have-nots in Latin America, it's quite interesting to note that the haves country tend to adopt a more pragmatic behavior for a number of reasons. Well, generally, have country may be more satisfied with the current state of affairs. Also, if you have an extensive network because of your resources, because of your global reach and interest, then you can play more pragmatically at different tables and with different actors. But what happens if you are a have-not? You don't have many resources, you don't have a large network, you don't have global reach or global interest. Then your options are reduced. And you may be tempted to use the ideological, the radical card, in order to have your own interest discussed on the regional or international agenda. What about allies as a resource, as a means? Well, let me give you two cases that are quite enlightening. Small Uruguay and Paraguay have consistently played Argentina and Brazil off against one another in order to obtain more concessions. Was this for ideological reasons? Well, partly. But this was also quite smart and pragmatic behavior. You know where to extract concessions and how to do it, sometimes using ideological disputes. There is another interesting example, that is Bolivia, and especially the initial stance that President Morales took after his election, his first election in 2005. Now, it's very hard to imagine Morales taking such bold initiatives and positions at home if it was not because he could count on allies in the region, such as Venezuela. In my view, if we hadn't had a Chavez phenomenon, we would have hardly had a Morales phenomenon, at least to the same extent as we have had and we're still having these days. And finally, think of ideology as a resource, as a means in itself. Were it not for the Cuban Revolution, would Cuba have such a huge strategic value? Would have Cuba attracted so much attention in intellectual circles, academic circles, and policy circles without the Castro Revolution? Had Cuba been another Caribbean island, say, modeled on the Puerto Rican economic and political system, would we have ever paid so much attention to Cuba? So ideology in itself could be a good card to play to have the international concert, either at the regional or the global level, to pay attention to you and your place. Now, you may wonder, do similar countries, similar in terms of resources, in terms of context, in terms of endowment, behave internationally in the same way? Well, I have a lot of problems with that, but also there is historical evidence suggesting that it's not like that. And I hope we can all agree that to have those two different types of leadership in a country may make a difference. But, of course, this is a kind of extreme example. Let me go back to the tales of the two Roberts. The first being Robert Kennedy. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President John Kennedy convened an executive committee composed of some of the 30 brightest minds in the United States to try and sort the Cuban Missile Crisis without nuclear war. Well, with the benefit of the hindsight, a few years after the crisis, Robert Kennedy wrote a very powerful account of that crisis. And he said, you know, those people in the committee, some 30 of them, were really the smartest and the brightest in the US. However, if 6 of them had been president, we would have had nuclear war. So the fact that John Kennedy was the president of the US, and not some of the other people on that committee, actually did make a difference. But also from a more theoretical point of view, there is good ground to suggest that actually aging, the human factor, does make a difference. And Robert Jervis was a pioneer in foreign policy studies, and the study of perceptions suggests that, you know, the baggage that each of us bring into our own position as students, teachers, fathers, brothers, mothers, sisters, actually our own story, our own personality has an impact on the type of decisions we make, on the type of leadership, skills and style we display. And this is also true if you look at the quality of elites. I was really very interested in the presentation by Julian Messina this morning, and what is the explanation, or one of the possible explanations of the economic and social improvements in Latin America since 2003? Well, there are authors who suggest that one of the key factors was an improvement in the elites. the ruling class are better today than they used to be 20 or 50 years ago. Whether or not this is true is probably debatable. But still, this argument has been made with reference to Latin America, and it has also been made to reference to Africa, for instance. So there is, I think, good ground to maintain this position. Also, personal ideas and beliefs provide roadmaps when there is uncertainty about the course of action. Again, I have a few examples here. One from Argentina, soon after the 2001 crisis, when President Nestor Kirchner took power. Basically, in his view, it was very important to reactivate production and employment in the country. But it was not clear how to do that. It was possible to choose to take side with the IMF, with the US, and pursue a kind of traditional orthodox recipe of austerity, or in fact to take a more mixed approach to the management of the economy and the foreign policy. Because of his own belief, President Kirchner decided to go for a mixed approach rather than an orthodox one. But I can give you another example that also is quite illustrative of how beliefs and ideas actually determine the course of foreign policy when there is an uncertainty of information. In 2008, when Colombia bombarded Ecuadorian territory trying to capture or destroy a FARC base that happened to be just on the other side of the Ecuadorian border, President Chavez of Venezuela immediately condemned the actions by Colombia and the US, even if there was no evidence at the time of any direct US involvement. But because of his reading that most of the problems of Latin America were connected with US presence, the Venezuelan government issued this statement condemning both Colombia and the US. And finally, if you look at the case of Chile, this is also quite interesting because you have socialist presidents like Ricardo Lagos or Michel Bachelet who decided to follow continuity in foreign policy, and especially in foreign trade policy. They could have decided to go for another approach, but there is an acceptance in Chile about the international identity of the country. And even socialist presidents decided to follow the belief that the Chilean model is reasonably successful. So also the agent who is in charge may determine a more ideological or a more pragmatic stance in foreign policy. And here we come at the process of foreign policy, so the way in which we design, adopt, and implement. Of course, timing is important. Regime type is important. Why so? If we look, for instance, at the extensiveness and inclusiveness of the foreign policy process, again, evidence suggests and historical experience suggests, patterns suggest that the more open and the more inclusive the process is, the more pragmatic the outcome tends to be. Because the larger the number of the stakeholders, the larger the number of options assessed is. Therefore, it's quite likely that the outcome of foreign policy will be the compromise among different positions at the domestic level. If you live in a dictatorship, it's very likely that a small circle of people will decide according to their own preferences and objectives without consulting widely and without being forced to reach a compromise with other interests or with other sectors in civil society. The typical example is the Brazilian foreign policy that is considered relatively successful, and Itamaraty, that was long considered a quite insulated agency within the Brazilian government, has recently become much more open to suggestion and participation from civil society, but also from other government branches. At the other side of the spectrum, if you look at, for instance, Venezuelan or Bolivian foreign policy, you can detect what the literature has labeled groupthink or new group syndrome. when a small group of people don't consult widely, are not exposed to different ideas, but they just talk to one another, between like-minded people, the outcome is very likely to be quite ideological, based on those shared principles in that small group. And also, if you're a newcomer to power, there is this new group syndrome. That is, because you're new, you need to show results. If you make a point that you're different from what was happening in the past, you need to show results quite quickly. That could explain some of the early decisions taken by Evo Morales, for instance, sending the military to patrol oil and gas fields. It was not a great example of pragmatism. It was a kind of ideological stance. But also you have organizational processes and bureaucratic policies. That is, what happens within a government. What kind of rules determine the process of adoption, discussion, and implementation of foreign policy? Let's see, I still have 10 minutes, so I'll cut short on this. I'll give you just a quite interesting example from, again, from Brazil, about how Brazil decided their own position during the negotiations for Mercosur. Within the Brazilian government, the Customs Policy Committee that pertains to the Ministry of the Economy showed a quite open attitude. This agency was quite open to concessions to Argentina, later on Uruguay and Paraguay, and was more open to liberalization than other government agencies within Brazil. Like, for instance, the Agency for External Trade, CACEX, that had a much more protectionist attitude at its core values. So the Brazilian negotiating position with the Argentines first and later on with the Uruguayans and Paraguayans was in fact a compromise between different positions within the government. But also, if you look at the presence of relevant foreign players, they may determine more ideological or pragmatic stances and marks in foreign policy. I give you just the example of the 2005 elections in Bolivia and what followed in terms of foreign policy. The fact that the US publicly opposed candidate Evo Morales actually resulted in a larger support for that candidate, because the Bolivian electorate thought, we don't want foreign interference. We perceive this as unfair. This strengthened, in fact, the campaign by Evo Morales, and that also resulted in quite strong ideological foreign policy position in the first mandate of the president. This is even more obvious if you look at the role of the US in, for instance, trade, foreign trade issues, or the fight against narco-trafficking in countries such as Mexico and Colombia. Finally, the fifth point is about how the structure of the system influences foreign policy and influences the more pragmatic or ideological stance. First of all, the structure provides both opportunities and constraints. If we're now moving towards a more genuinely multipolar world, it means that more allies, more negotiating options are available. And in fact, if you look at the literature about polarity and balance of power, this literature seems to suggest that polarity generates conformity of behavior, whereas balance of power would generate more flexible behavior in foreign policy. You may want also to associate these concepts with ideology and conformity on the one hand, and with flexibility and pragmatism on the other. Why so? Think of polarity. In a multipolar world, more actors, more tables are available, therefore you have more room for maneuvering. You may have more pragmatic behavior. If you think of unipolarity in the country, a typical example, the unipolar moment, in the 1990s, basically all Latin American governments except Cuba aligned themselves with US's preferences in terms of democracy, free trade, open economies. in that case, ideology and pragmatism almost coincided, because to have an ideological alignment with the US was a quite pragmatic choice in the mid-1990s. Also, if you look at, for instance, the domestic context, this is also part of the structure and how this influences foreign policy behavior and stances. Let me give you one example. That is the presence of nationalism in Latin America these days. Nationalism could be perceived as a sort of tribalist, almost bellicose concept and stance, or, on the other hand, it could be understood as an emancipatory concept, sort of civic liberation tool and instrument. If you focus on the latter concept, well, imagine that these days, in Latin America, we have at least 3 different levels where you can see this resurgence of nationalism. The indigenous nations, so attention to the indigenous, to the native population. At the national level, emancipation from US tutelage or interference or influence. But also at the regional level, Latin America or South America or sub-regions of Latin America as regions that actually set an example opposing imperialism, opposing capitalism, and you choose the examples you prefer. So in this sense, the context is also defined by ideas that shape the national context, like nationalism, and how nationalism actually may determine more or less pragmatic or ideological stances in foreign policy. This is about the 5 factors. But let me tell you about 2 things that for me have changed the landscape of Latin American foreign policy quite considerably. Well, the first one is pretty obvious, and it's the emergence of China. China not only influences the context of the foreign policy of many Latin American countries, but it has really changed the ends and purposes. Many countries in Latin America have somehow redirected their foreign policy, and in particular their foreign trade policy, towards Asia and China. What does this mean in terms of the employment of more pragmatic or ideological stances? What does it mean in terms of short-term, medium-term, and long-term strategies, benefits, and problems? I can certainly think of the example of Ecuador that accepted loans from China that overall imposed worse conditions than loans from the traditional suspects, the usual suspects, the IMF, for instance. China was not imposing a higher interest rate, but the value China gave to oil reserves, for instance, was lower than the international market price. So in the end, Ecuador ended up guaranteeing the credit received by paying more in terms of guaranteeing, because the price decided by the Chinese for oil, for Ecuadorian oil, was lower than the market price. Was it worth getting a loan from China rather than the IMF just to mark the point of enfranchisement from the Washington institutions? You may decide that it was or that it was not. And then, for those of you who have studied with Andres here, I'm sure you have already seen this, that is part of our joint article on the peak of regionalism. Well, as Amita reminded us yesterday, Latin America is probably the region with the longest tradition in regionalism. I'm not entering the discussion what type of regionalism, is it integration, cooperation, or other forms, but regionalism. And we have so many varieties of regionalism that actually regionalism is a form of foreign policy. And with so much variety, you also have many foreign policy choices that Latin American countries can make today. So the idea that a Latin American country may join 3, 4, 5, 6 different regionalisms or regional projects, is that an example of pragmatism Or is that an example of quite strong ideological stance? Or is it again a signal of completely erratic foreign policy choices? My personal view is that this tends to be a pragmatic behavior. I see more pragmatism than ideology or erratic behavior. And in order to justify this understanding, I have proposed somewhere else the concept of modular regionalism. What does it mean? It means that the Latin American regional architecture is composed of modules. Now, in the 1960s, Latin American regionalism was defined as closed because it aimed at insulating the region from competition from other parts of the world, so that by high tariffs you could protect infant industry. In the 1990s, the overall trend of Latin American regionalism was open regionalism, meaning opening the region to competition, to globalization, to trade with other countries by lowering trade barriers. Now, modular regionalism does the same trick, in my view, for the current picture. Modular regionalism does not explain why ALBA was created, why Mercosur was reformed, why the Pacific Alliance was set up, but it captured the spirit or the mood of our epoch, our time. So regionalism in Latin America is now really modular. You can pick and choose between apparently contradictory options, but perhaps they're not contradictory. They just serve different purposes, different ends of foreign policy. They may serve countries with different available needs. They can reflect the preferences of different agents. They may epitomize different processes of foreign policy designing, adoption, and implementation. And they may reflect this multiple, multiplex, multi-level structure of governance at the international level. And therefore, to conclude, how is it possible to combine pragmatism and ideology in foreign policy? Well, I've already said, I think that what we see today in Latin America, and this is the interesting phenomenon, it's a surge in both pragmatism and ideology. The ideological component becomes stronger and stronger, but so does the pragmatic component. How is that possible? Well, one of the possible explanations is the huge gap between discourse and action in Latin American foreign policy. One thing is what politicians say, a different thing is what diplomats negotiate. But there is a second level gap, that is between what diplomats negotiate and what actually happens on the ground. So you have a double gap between rhetoric and practice. Also, this conceptual framework of this reading of foreign policy between ideology and pragmatism is a framework. But of course the results are country specific. The framework does not tell you or does not give you a general law that says, well, if the leaders are so and so and the available means are X and Y, then you have more pragmatism. No, this is really country specific. The framework only tells you, if you want to understand and make sense of the surge in pragmatism and the surge in ideology, say in Argentina, you may want to look at ends and purposes, available means, the human factor, the process, and the context. And the final conclusion is that foreign policy par excellence is the domain of continuity in policy. Even where you have the more erratic behavior, I think that foreign policy in general is characterized by more continuity than change. And if the Argentines in the room, especially one, allows me to use Argentina as an example again, the only continuity you can detect in Argentine foreign policy, it's erratic behavior. But that's continuity in a way. It's not that different. By the same token, if you look at Brazilian, Chilean foreign policy, there is a trait of continuity that is quite evident. I thank you for your attention. I'm very open to receive comments, even nasty ones, observations, and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting presentation. I will abuse my position as chair. I'm always trying to do it. So, but I'll limit myself to just one question. You stress the importance of agency, but you described the type of leadership, the quality of leads. You didn't touch upon the role of civil society in shaping foreign policy, where, of course, civil society do play a role, not in every country they do. But I was thinking also, like this morning, listening to Patrick's presentation about collective memory. In countries where civil society does play a role, do you think that collective memory also does, in the sense that helps a bit the elites and leaders in choosing between ideology or pragmatism or combining both in that approach?
Can I ask one at a time? I think it's more direct. These three things, the three questions, I always forget the first one by the time the speaker answers. If you don't mind, I'd rather go for this and tackle this first. Now, what does civil society fit in all this? It doesn't fit in the leadership or agent factors as much as in the process factor, to my understanding. Okay, so the way you design, adopt and implement foreign policy, I would like to look at where civil society actually, where does it interact? Typical example, the role of lobby and business in Latin American foreign policy. I started that with specific reference with Mercosur, and one of the problems is not the lack of access, is the wrong level of access. So many businessmen or many businesses, associations, big and small, tend to establish a dialogue with ministries of economy in Latin America. But most decisions are taken by chancelleries. But that's standard theory of lobby and business-government relation. It's nothing new. That's why my understanding is rather to have civil society at the process level rather than single individual influencing the process.
Probably European lobby better answers to that.
But that's the thing. If you want to understand Latin America, forget about Europe. So the idea that there is a Brussels lobby, I don't really see any wise businessman going to the Secretariat of Mercosur in Montevideo to change any Mercosur legislation. First of all, because it has to be internalized. So you want to save time and money and campaign at the national level. But also because these are intergovernmental organizations. Okay? There is no sovereignty sharing. So decisions are basically taken by presidents or government representatives. So the best you can do as a lobbyist is to go to your national government and campaign to shape the national position in international negotiation. Okay? The idea of having someone in Brussels rather than either in Montevideo or I don't know, in Quito for UNASUR doesn't make any sense. Okay? That's why I think if you want to understand that kind of dynamics, you have to forget about Europe. It's just not the same thing. It doesn't apply. About collective memory, I very much appreciate the point. I entirely agree. I think that, of course, collective memory and the way in which a certain collective memory is internalized by a country and its leadership is very important. I can think of Chile as a good example, and let's use that as a good example. It seems to me that in Chile there is a consensus across the political spectrum that the dictatorship was not the product of one party wrongdoing, but it was the result of a number of situations to which all segments of society contributed in one way or another. Okay? So this idea is that there is a quite shared collective memory that leads to certain policy decisions. For instance, the foreign trade policy of Chile and also the economic policy of Chile has a clear trait of continuity that dates back to the dictatorship years. But because it has proven to be relatively successful through a number of adjustments, the current administration has decided not to change it. But also because there is a double agreement on what is the collective memories of those years. So there were things that did work and were not removed just because they belonged to the dictatorship. But also there is another agreement in the Chilean political spectrum. That is, in the Concertación coalition, where the socialists and the Christian Democrats dominate the coalition, if the socialists tend to go too radical, too much towards the left, then the Christian Democrats would keep them. But if the Christian Democrats are not active enough, then the socialists would push for a more dynamic agenda. And there is a kind of consensus about that in my personal reading. That's my personal understanding.
Okay.
So you mentioned the ideology, but I think all of the concepts we talked about, they are also part of using symbology, kind of as a form of signaling. And given that this kind of Iberian heritage these countries share, there is an increased amount of opportunity to signal, in a mutually comprehensible environment and so on. And so this kind of suggests this kind of I don't know, I think maybe it's a wrong impression, you could be correct, I'm sure, that in South America, even though, there's no like common entity to train the leaders, there's no single framework to prepare them, so they're not, coordinating like the Navy SEALs would, with the science or whatever, but there is this impression in me that Sun Tzu is very right, or he's being employed here, that march divided and fight together kind of concept. So I think in South America, all these different organizations, as you refer to them as modular, but I mean they do use them as different methods to show solidarity every now and then, and this is interesting because they are competitors in many ways. And so how would you describe the level of cooperation, the solidarity level of cooperation, signaling? So how much would you call it, marching divided and fighting together, or something else?
Okay, thank you. I think I will probably need a very long time to answer that question. This is one of the key debates in literature about, to what extent we have achievement, to what extent we have coordination among all these organizations, what is possible to do together and what is not possible. But let me start with the kind of symbolism thing. I absolutely agree. Symbolism is part of any ideology or any ideological stance, okay? So that's absolutely fine. And also joining certain organization or creating certain organization or strongly marking certain aspects of certain organization is part of a symbolic position. Okay, that's for sure. Now, to what extent cooperation is possible? I think there is a lot of cooperation going on in Latin America, a lot. What is not happening is integration, understood in the traditional sense. Okay, in kind of economic terms, removing circulation of goods, services, capital, eventually people. However, once again, I would forget the European lenses. Because if you look at the Latin American symbolism, for instance, integration, integración, has a very strong symbolic meaning in terms of solidarity, in terms of unity, in terms of identity. If you have two under-secretary of states meeting over lunch, probably some daily paper will have a big title saying, well, this is a historical step towards integration. But it's not what we mean, maybe in Europe or in the literature, the academic literature, by integration. But this is a different thing. Probably someone in Argentina or in Venezuela reading the paper will say, oh yeah, that makes sense. So it's also the words we employ. So I do believe that there is a lot of cooperation going on. A lot in all sorts of fields, from education, science and technology, even trade if you want. What we don't have is integration. But cooperation, there is a lot. There is also some sign of innovative cooperation. Like one of the problems of the multiplication of organization is waste of time and resources, money. Okay? And also the time that leaders employ to follow all this. Well, the Pacific Alliance has recently started holding video conference summits. So they're cheaper, okay? They don't involve a lot of traveling. Probably they're much quicker to prepare. So this is innovative solution, if you want, to cooperation.
Okay, we have Professor John.
Okay, thank you very much. Very
Luca.
Gian Luca. So it's very, very interesting. I don't have any problem with your framework, but I found a problem with your application to Brazil. And I have a major disagreement with you in this because you characterize as predominantly pragmatic the Brazilian foreign policy. And I would say it was predominantly pragmatic in the late 90s, in the early 2000s, until there is a transition period between 23 and 25, 26, in which the economic policy was pragmatic, was in continuity, but the foreign policy was already has guided a strong ideology like against the free trade area of America because since the submission to imperialists, a lot of restrictions in relation to a free trade agreement with the European Union and Mercosur. Okay? And beginning in 2006 with the Mantica and the Minister of the Economy, we are moving radically to an ideological foreign policy in economic foreign policy. Meaning there is a conversion between the foreign policy from the Minister of Foreign Affairs that was already had more ideological with the economic policy that is eliminating any possibility of opening the economy. To the contrary, moving fastly since 2009 to close. So it's when a lot of indications were in favor of that what Brazil was needing dramatically for increasing productivity and competitivity in the world economy was opening. Okay, so there is a major, and this was deepening much more during the Dilma Rousseff administration. The first Dilma, this is changing in the second Dilma. Okay, but the first Dilma, and with a lot of there was an ideological foreign policy related. Not as you said, we have all these things, but it predominates ideological during the, I would say, starting clearly in 2006 until 2014, but with elements already of strong ideological since 2003 to 2006. We have ideological from Amorim and pragmatic from Palocci, the Minister of Education. Okay? So the question is that this has caused dramatic, for that reason there is a significant, after some appearance of rising of Brazil in the world system, there is a dramatic decline of Brazil. Why? Because during this whole period, there is a dramatic decline in productivity in the economy, except in the agribusiness and the iron ore production. All the other sectors of the economy, that's most of the population, is declining in productivity, industry and services. And this is for sure a recipe for the decline of the country, not for the rise. So this is, I would like to call you realist because you are buying a lot the general discourse that was present. Fortunately, it's not anymore present right now, but it was present a lot in the late 5 years ago about the pricing of Brazil, how pragmatic was Lula and all this. But it's much more complex. It's not that way.
No, I agree. This is a 40-minute presentation, so I had, if you want, to oversimplify some of the issues, okay? However, I still think that the ideological card in Brazilian foreign policy was played for quite pragmatic ends and purposes. And I think, for instance, the expansion of the Brazilian presence in Africa, which does not make too much sense in economic terms, or only to an extent, but it does make a lot of sense in political terms. Okay, so in this sense, I think you're right, the ideological component is quite there, but it also serves some pragmatic ends and goals. Okay, so what I like of this framework is that we can both play with it and justify. For instance, when you mention Lula and Dilma, For instance, I think this would fit perfectly the Asian part of the framework. So Lula had a clear interest in foreign policy. He was much more interested, he was much more active, and you can also say that he used ideology in a much more effective way. Dilma, as an actor, she's not that interested in foreign policy, if at all. She's into other things.
But this question is simple. The most important question is the major rupture is not between Lula and Dilma. It's between Lula in the first term and Lula second term and Lula and Dilma. In fact, Lula first term is with policy in a move even with continuing some macroeconomic reforms oriented to an open economy increasing Brazilian productivity, even if there was not a conceptual in the Lula's mind. But this was in Palos's mind, and the whole team of Palos, and Meireles in the central bank. Okay? After there was a defensive Meireles against the closing approach to the world of Mantega and Lula that was okay to be that. And so the major difference is not about this is the common view. It's activism versus not activism. But I think this is not the most important issue for the Center for the more important issue is about principle and ideology and pragmatism. And ideology is the idea, when you take the idea of come back to your origins as a party and you close the economy. And you close the economy with dramatic cost. And now we are there. Okay? And when you needed to take, you needed to increase the productivity of the Brazilian economy according to the increase of the productivity of the global economy. And we didn't do this.
That's okay, and I take the point. However, my response to that is, in a way, along the lines you're drawing. Brazil has been punching well above its own weight for a while. And that's the result of using ideological arguments to advance pragmatic goals. I mean, Brazil now contributes to, for instance, the budget of the World Trade Organization as much as Belgium does. Contributes to the UN budget half of what Italy does. Italy is not an emerging power. You would not call Belgium any global player. So in spite of some indicators that Brazil is punching above its weight, Brazil was very good at selling its own story and narratives. In spite of the shortcomings you have absolutely correctly highlighted, and which I'm happy to buy. But I still maintain that, to me, Brazilian foreign policy was quite pragmatic, also when there was a strong use of ideological positions around it. But that's, of course, my kind of side of the story, and I'm happy to listen to yours and take it into full consideration.
Thank you. I agree with you. I think there is no such thing as non-ideological foreign policy. And my question is, why do you think ideology is so badly seen when related to foreign policy? Normally in Latin American countries, they relate that to Bolivarianism. Why do you think that happens?
I think this is a historical trajectory in terms of defining the meaning of the word. Okay, if you read the chapter from which this presentation is actually taken, I reconstruct the use of ideology and the application of ideology to foreign policy. Okay, so ideology was born as a concept to identify a would-be science of ideas. That's the etymology of the word. Okay, then Marx read it as a kind of negative concept. Ideologies as the power of just ideas that are not based in material dialectics and evidence. And from then on, it has been applied more and more in this, or with this connotation. And when you look at the application of the word ideology to foreign policy, it has always been the case that this application has reflected a dichotomy between some good concepts and ideology. For instance, some other authors have not used specifically the word ideology, they use solidarism. But of course, solidarity, especially in Latin America, is a quite ideological stance. Saying that regionalism promotes solidarity, it's great. But if you go to Buenos Aires and ask the middle, upper, or lower class what they think of Paraguayans and Bolivians, I'm not quite sure you will see a lot of solidarity, at least not where I used to to leave. So I'm not quite sure about that. And this was then consistently applied with this kind of, there are some good things like liberal thinkers, for instance, used always this liberal, science-based, evidence-based versus ideological positions, based on principles with no justification. My answer to that, and you're absolutely right in that, is if you look at pragmatism, pragmatism is not value-free. Same as ideology. So any foreign policy or any policy is at least in part ideological. Because only, or policy that is ideology only, would be wishful thinking or utopia. Something that is pragmatic only would be literally short-term opportunism, if you take it to the extreme, with no value or principle belief guiding it. So I think that's the historical trajectory that led to this misuse, if you want to.
Okay, Beatrice?
I actually like to contribute to that discussion, just purely because I think if you look at it from a post-structuralist perspective, everything is an idea, even liberalism to Marxism to any kind of religion. So in that sense, I think it neutralizes the term per se, and then just using it for what it is and trying to understand it for how it's applied, rather than having that kind of Marxist, kind of critical connotation of giving that thing, Because I think even the kind of European notion of this normative power is just ideological driven, as you were saying, and the value system as everything else. I think that in that sense, maybe you need to read that literature to get if you're interested in applying that. My question,
sorry, just if I may interject, because this is directly related. If you think of normative power, the most normative power of all is the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty obvious, but we perceive hard power and normative power as in opposition. It is not the case. And if you're interested in that specific discussion on ideology and pragmatism, there is a special issue of Millennium, I think 2002, that it's devoted exactly to the use of those two concepts in political science and IR. Sorry.
My question is actually relates to that because so you had these two or three categories: the pragmatism, ideology, and the Arabism.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was more of a provocation.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But what I was actually, and maybe you addressed this in your book and not in the presentation, so I think I'm asking something that you already dealt with. But what I want to see is the kind of the link between that and that structure agent, the kind of IR theory link between how do you, can you categorize, because, we're always very good at IR coming up with these neat tables, format, have you done that? Or are you thinking about it?
It's in there. I kind of started drawing it a little bit then for question of time. But to come back, each of the 5 factors actually has a connotation in terms of how these factors impact the employment of either pragmatism or ideology. For instance, if you look at the debates between the have and have-nots, haves country tend to be more status quo country, so they have a more pragmatic stance. Well, have-nots may be tempted to use more ideological, or really in this case, to go back to Felipe's kind of question, radical. Not necessarily negative, but in fact you end up considering it as a negative kind of thing. So they have this behavior because sometimes a strong ideological position is the only weapon you have to attract attention. By the same token, you have certain leaders who are more prone to ideological positions than others. Okay, be because of their education, background, or beliefs. And there's plenty of that. Once again, ideology could be a good thing. Gandhi was guided by ideological principles, wasn't he?
Yeah, but I'm just trying to understand whether you can use it as a kind of model to predict.
No.
Or kind of look at some
No.
pattern.
It's not to predict.
Okay.
It's not to predict, it's only explanatory.
Okay.
As I said, this is a framework, but the results are country specific. So they're country dependent. You have to look at country and say, well, I detect both ideology and pragmatism. I'm tempted to say this is more ideological and more pragmatic. Okay. Let me see if I apply these 5 categories, these 5 factors, what is the result?
Okay.
And this is very carefully explained. I'm not suggesting any law-like kind of model.
No, because I was wondering if you were going in a kind of Jarvis sense, had the in-group, out-group, and trying to make the connotation between if you...
There is, of course, some of that, but I don't go that far.
Okay.
Beverly?
Sure. Thanks very much. I guess I also had a conceptual situating it within IR theory type question. And I in terms of the practice turn in IR, to what extent do you, as your framework, engage with the idea of habit, that we might just do things out of habit?
Yeah, okay. Now, about prudence, this is really a choice of words. Some of the literature, as you say, prefer the use of the word prudence. I'm not quite sure that the conceptual distinction is that strong. Okay, so I'm quite happy to use pragmatism and prudence almost interchangeably for the sake of this kind of analysis. I don't have the reference here, but I can find it for you. In fact, if you read the chapter, there is a specific there is a specific reference to prudence, and let me see. Well, I'll check it for you in a second without stealing time, but it's here. That's exactly, I was also, I mean, my attention was also captured exactly by this different use of, for instance, ideology and solidarity, pragmatism and prudence. So the same concept may have slightly different connotations. That's one thing. And the second one was the practice turn and habits. I'm not quite sure how you would relate habit and practice in terms of we just do things because we've always done that. I mean, this is in a way taken into account in the idea that process, for instance, is part of this discussion. Okay, so the way in which we adopt things, the kind of procedure, the practice is there, and unless there is something significant happening, that will not change. So we will just replicate that because we've always done it like this. But there is also this idea that is Cohen and Goldstein about how ideas and therefore ideology informs foreign policy and the practice of it. So how do you move from the theoretical to the practical level? And ideology gives you roadmaps. So in case of uncertainty, you follow kind of pattern that derives from your own principled beliefs. Or there is another way to see how you move from the theory to the practice level, and that is in the absence of change, norms remain the same. So if there is no significant change, you just follow the same norms. So the same ideological position or the same ideas will inform your policy unless something significant happens. And that's the third dimension of Goldstein and Cohen, which is a standard reading. I mean, I'm not inventing anything new here.
Professor?
Gian Luca, I was wondering about the use of erratic behavior, erratic observations that you make in the framework. I understand it correctly that it's more directed towards description and explanation and understanding, sort of as analytical tools that you apply. If you want to assess outcome, you say it's just a matter of studying the one particular policy decision in one particular country. Okay, so I wonder whether I could probe you a bit on, if you like, the erratic side of things. And I'm doing this because I was recently coming across, and some others of you might have seen that as well, Stephen Wall summarizing IR in 5 minutes,
okay.
And saying there are five points to be reckoned with: anarchy, balance of power, comparative advantage, social construction and social constructivism, and the fifth one was miscalculations, misperceptions, he agreed stupidity. And because in your presentation several times you said, well, this is rather erratic, it's difficult to explain it, it's contradictory in itself. So if you probe it a bit further, maybe there is something where you could say that a particular mixture might more likely lead to some sort of erratic, at the end, looking back at it, rather stupid outcome. Or would you say, no, you can't take it that far, it's as with all these other elements, that it's fairly falling short of any larger, if you like, predictive, prognostic capacity?
Yeah, thank you for this question, which gives me a chance to clarify this, which will remain probably a bit obscure in the presentation. The emphasis is on ideology and pragmatism rather than on erratic behavior. If you ask me what I said, you said there were continuous references, but the continuous references were to apparently erratic behavior. The whole point here is to try and explain this apparently erratic behavior in a different way. So it's not that erratic. It's in fact the result of either ideological or pragmatic calculations. Then, as you suggest, and that's correct, this is only a framework. So the results are definitely country-specific, but they're also time-specific. Okay, it's not only geographical context, but it's also chronological context. I don't think you can really say, you know, for 200 years of independent history, Argentinian foreign policy was so and so. You can certainly have certain periods and analyze them if it makes sense. But no, I don't believe you have a lot of erratic behavior. I think there are more convincing explanations than, oh, this is just erratic. There is no sense of direction, there is no justification for adopting a certain measure other than, you know, it's nonsense. I think there is always a better explanation than that, but that could be my kind of optimistic assessment of policy making. I mean, having worked as a non-academic for many years before returning from academia, I have not seen many cases where, you know, a policy just decided out of, you know, someone wakes up in the morning and says, oh, today we're going to do that. And there's no explanation for that. I can't really think of that. I cannot think of a single episode.
So you too much continuity in the whole world setup.
Exactly, you're right. If
and
one thing...
If I may, one additional thought is then related to learning. I mean, the notion of really making a proper assessment of what went right and wrong and whether one achieved certain things that one had in mind, etc. You find cases where the actors themselves apply some sort of that framework in themselves and then sort of properly assess the situation before they sort of move out with a statement or a particular policy, where they draw on lessons learned in other cases. Is that something that can be shown?
I think I can think of two cases which I know a little bit better. Of course, again, I don't know all the case studies. The book is a medical book, so you should talk really to the experts. But certainly, the Ecuadorian case is quite interesting. And I think the Curie administration has corrected its own position on a number of occasions. And my sense is that the Morales administration in Bolivia has definitely corrected their policies and stances on a number of occasions, especially in the second mandate. And the results are there, by the way. So if you look at their economic performance and their role in regional and international concessions, this is quite evident, I would say. Especially if you look at the economic performance in Bolivia. You can make a number of arguments, it depends on international prices and things, but I think there is also a lot related to policy decisions. And less dogmatic or ideological positions.
Monica, please.
Well, I just wanted to draw a little bit on what David was commenting before, and also Felipe, and I was wondering why you chose this concept of ideological, because it seems like it's problematic for me since, since both what you call it pragmatic is also ideological. I don't know, I was wondering if aligned or non-aligned terms that would reflect better on where you're trying. Because, the term pragmatic is also charged with ideology. What is behind pragmatic decision is also infused by what a person thinks can bring certain result, and as well, an ideological decision is also influenced by what a leader or a policymaker can think and bring results. So I was wondering why you decided to use the term.
Well, thanks. There are two explanations. One more serious and academic, and the other more realistic, but less serious. Okay. The more serious and academic is that the decision is based on an empirical observation. So you look at the Latin American cases in the last 10, 15 years, and you have a surge of both ideological stances, the use of symbolism, the use of rhetoric, and you also have a rise in pragmatism. So very pragmatic behavior. You say something, but you behave differently. That's the serious kind of thing. That's where the whole idea comes from. And by the way, feel free to choose another label. The reason, the less serious but perhaps most effective reason why we decided to go for this is is quite eye-catching and generates debate. Okay, so ideology and pragmatism, it's almost intuitive. You may not like it after 3 hours of thinking, oh, but I can find flaws in this concept. But you immediately understand what I'm talking about. So I've reached my objective. And you've bought my argument.
And also, I think it's also a question of priorities, not that both terms are mutually exclusive, but in the idealistic kind of approach, you prioritize something, ideas for this, but you don't necessarily take pragmatism, and it works the other way around.
Yeah, and the other way around towards addressing, of course. Yeah.
Just a quick question. A good friend of mine who served as an advisor on foreign policy for a while in Brazil, a friend of ours. Often he would say, so I also agree, there's no non-ideological foreign policy, and there's no foreign policy decision or action that occurs for no reason, right? But having said that, often he would say, so my boss the other day gets caught out by a reporter, wasn't thinking about it, slipped up, said something very stupid about Venezuela and Colombia's conflict and Brazil's position towards it. And then, obviously, that created an event, that started a narrative about this. And he said, and now me and 8 other people are going to turn what was essentially a stupid slip-up at 8 o'clock in the morning before having his coffee into a policy position. Right? And so, but what we're going to read about it in the next 20 years when you study this case study is how this made sense because, so this reflects a long-standing policy of so-and-so, or this has to do with a change in policy between this country and that country. So it is their job as advisors to coherently make it appear as following either a pragmatist or an ideological line, but you can't really say, well, he literally just made a mistake, or he spoke out of turn, or he doesn't know what he's talking about. So the system of foreign policy that has advisors beyond decision makers will normalize a lot of it. Now, I wanted to get a feeling of what you think about this and how prevalent do you think this is and how this affects our analysis of it.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
This one, just I'm not saying that I have seen such a situation, but let us imagine that I did. I think most of the time when you have this kind of occurrence, then you usually have them slip up on some minor detail of what they say, and the rest is actually usually useful because their brain is already full of that stuff. So what I'm trying to say is that you probably cannot make the kind of mistake which you cannot correct because most of it actually has rationale to it, and there's just like a small bit that you have to correct somehow. So I'm not sure. I mean, because it's not like black and white mistakes and good policies. So that's my addition on this one. But sorry.
No, I mean you started basically where I wanted to finish. But first of all, I cannot think of any mistake or slip about which we will talk for the next 20 years in terms of defining a policy. If we will talk for the next 20 years about the policy because there is a sort of consistent argument about it, not because at 8 a.m. your boss just slipped the wrong word. It's very unlikely, at least in my experience. That's the first thing. The second, this I think would fit the framework in the process. So in the process, there is bad timing. And that's what happens. But also, this is not discussed in the presentation or the book, and very little in international relations, but there is the role of chance. Chance happens. Things happen by chance, by mistake. You're supposed to deliver the most important speech in your life, and something happens to your car, and you're late, and all speculation starts, and this is possible, but I don't think this is decisive. But certainly the role of chance is something that could be discussed more, or the role of mistake. To what extent chance or mistake actually determine a long-lasting policy or course of action, I'm not that sure.
If nothing else, just in terms of public perception. So one of our prime ministers, and people still talk about this today, was seen as somebody who didn't know much about management or the numbers of the economy because he was asked about the GDP and he made it very short, he fumbled it up. And later we found out, about 4 years later, that he was actually coming out of a call where he learned that his wife had cancer, and it was just a slip of attention. But that did create pressure on the government. It did create opposition, making something, do you know, so even just in terms of perception, it might be.
But what you're suggesting, in fact, has little to do with the role of political or policy advisors, and lot to do, especially in the most sophisticated governments, with the role of spin doctors, which in my view, personal view, are two different things.
Right. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, there are some moments in which you can talk about this severe mistake or rationality in the decision making, confused decision making, that would be very relevant for the future. One thing that is relevant in this meeting I recall now is this decision of invading the Falkland Malvinas by the Armenian military leadership. This was something really very confused position. Okay, very, I mean, with a lot of, some people talk a lot of alcohol in the decision making. Things like this. Okay, there are a lot of perfect storms somehow, and for making it. Of course, there is classical miscalculation. It's for sure, but it's also a real, very severe mistake. Okay, because with just the calculation, the preparation for the war would have been much more significant. There was not. Okay, so it's not only it's also real mistake and confusion.
Yeah, but that's, I think if I understand well what we were suggesting, this is a proper policy mistake. This is wrong policy. For producing bad outcomes, it's not just something that happened, you know, that morning, just a kind of accidental thing.
But
The decision to invade the Falklands in 1982 was not accidental.
Somehow, yes. I mean, there was not, partially it was accidental. This is what I am trying to make.
Do you think it was accidental?
Because there was not preparation for the war at all.
Okay, but that's different. Mussolini entered the Second World War without preparation, but it was not accidental.
It was bad policy.
It was bad policy. Stupid policy, if you want. I'm ready to go as far as that. But I can give you the opposite example where the use of alcohol led to very good outcomes. The independence of Namibia. Tonight, or last night, I left early. But you know, negotiations were stalled for the withdrawal of the Cuban troops from Angola. There was a night of huge partying, and Risquet, who was the head of the Cuban delegation, having a few too many, and he agreed to withdraw the Cuban troops. Then, of course, he had to call back about it and say, look, I've done this. What do you think about this? That's fine. We hope you negotiated something interesting. And that's where, you know, the kind of more policy explanation come into play, because the Cuban could show that by withdrawing from Angola, they were actually fostering the cause of African liberation and independence, because the South African would leave Namibia. And the South Africans were very happy. They said, yes, we leave Namibia, we concede independence, but we kick the communist Cubans out of the continent. But that was actually what happened. A huge drinking session where Malan and Risquet, after a few too many, started laughing and agreeing on a deal. That was not exactly the order they had received from their capitals, at least as far as I know the story. But there is good evidence about that. A lot of oral history material.
Okay, then on this drunk note, I think we can close the session. It was a very good one. Thank you very much, Professor.